morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of SMIE Consulting's Midweek Roundup. Today is September 11th, 2019, and I'm your host, Marty Bennett. Today we'll be bringing you 3 stories that have come across our news feeds in the last 2 weeks, including stories about visa problems at the border. Is this a new trend or just a minor blip? We'll also take a look at what's happening in global student mobility and a new research report that looks at ways that we can be, ways that we should be having a little bit more focus on what it takes to bring in and foster international student mobility. So we'll also take a look at Canada, what's happening north of the border. Their recently announced new international education strategy for the country and what that means for Canada and also implications for the United States. And we'll also take a look at what they're suggesting and what they're doing as part of their attempts to broaden what they do in international education, particularly with student mobility. So in terms of what we'll start with today, we're going to go back to we're going to go back to what we've talked about before with regard to international students entering the United States, and that will have to do with visas. We'll start that obviously at the new semester beginning. There's always challenges at the beginning of a new term with what international students are facing at the border, and stories of students getting turned away or deported, visas revoked, all have implications for what we do. Before we get into that, though, I just want to give a shout out to those who are listening on the podcast. We appreciate your support in listening to the Midweek Roundup every week on your favorite podcast provider, whether that be iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Podbean, or Spotify. We're happy that you're with us, and we're glad you're subscribing. For those that are watching live, thank you. It's always a pleasure to have live feedback for these midweek roundups, and we'll welcome your feedback throughout the day today as we go over these 3 stories, but also take a look back at September 11th at the end of the show today, and where were you during September 11th, 2001. So we'll talk about those 3 issues first, and to do so, we're going to look at, we talked last week about the story of the Harvard students that came on a full scholarship from Lebanon. He's a Palestinian refugee, been living in Lebanon for a number of years, came to the United States after going through the Education USA Advising Office in Lebanon through Ahmed East, and came to the United States after going through the Competitive College Club on a full scholarship, and has led to him being turned away initially at the border, even though he came on a full ride to Harvard, turned away and sent home with his initial visa revoked as a result of social media posts that his friends had made that were not favorable towards the United States. So now it seems Border Patrol officials are taking it upon themselves to check posts of friends of students on social media to see whether or not that's is now part of the evaluation of admitting a student or not to the United States. So very troubling. But eventually the good news, as we talked about last week, was that Harvard student was readmitted after folks from both Lebanon and Education USA, the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, as well as Harvard University president and others in the United States supporting the student's return to the U.S. So he was let in, and obviously CBP now has egg on their face as a result of that. But I think it's part of a larger problem at CBP with kind of an overreach for these frontline DHS officers at the border, interviewing students and going above what's actually required of them in terms of what the regulations state. And we'll talk more about that in that episode next week. But this particular story, Tom Flanagan, good to see you on. Long time no here. Hope you're all well, and give my best to Katie and the kids. Hopefully, when we get into this first story, I posted the link to it in the comments section on the Facebook page, out of the Chronicle of Higher Ed. It's about another great story by Karen Fisher. Visas revoked at the border put a new dent in American higher ed's image abroad. And as we've talked about many times on the podcast here through the Midweek Roundup, these kinds of issues when they receive the kinds of press that they do, often become monstrously larger than the actual reality of the situation of one student or a group of students. But we know that this Harvard student is not the only one that was impacted by the turnaround, deportation, and visa verification. We're a group of 9 Chinese students that entered the U.S. A couple weeks ago through Los Angeles, were detained and eventually deported for a variety of different reasons. They were all Arizona State students sent home. Many of them were STEM students, so that might have had something to do with it. Part of the larger tit for tat, as one commentator put it, in the ongoing battles between China and the United States. So it's interesting to see what's happening on that front, because obviously it's not just this Harvard student, but there were others in larger numbers. We know the battles that the U.S. are having with China now over trade wars and other political issues, and perhaps these students are getting caught up in that. There was also the story, as Karen points out in her Chronicle Store article, that there was a separate incident of a Chinese student coming into Detroit that was declared at the border when he was going through customs, that he had a bulletproof vest in his in his bags, and that's he was deemed a threat and then was sent back to China. But can you blame them with the press that they've heard, the official warning last year of U.S. being a dangerous place for Chinese students? That this student was taking what he saw as a reasonable precaution by packing a bulletproof vest into his armor, into his backpack, into his bags that was bringing into the United States. Vince, so glad you could join me from out in Colorado. Hope you're well. Talking about these students coming in, this student in Detroit that came in, we're looking forward to hearing that he was turned away, deported, and visa revoked because he was carrying a bulletproof vest. So obviously very bizarre situations happening that really don't leave a lot of answers. What we have seen, though, is another story that might contradict what we're seeing. And of course, there are hundreds of thousands of students that come into the United States each August to start the new academic year, returning students as well as new students. This next article from the Christian Science Monitor actually paints a fairly different picture of what's happening at the border, and actually references some students that were coming in to Temple, one from Turkmenistan, one from Peru, that had received You Are Welcome Here scholarships. We've talked about that program in the past, and it was referencing their ease of entry into the United States, and that no challenges whatsoever. It references the Harvard article, a Harvard student, as well as the Chinese students from Arizona State, but the reality for this group of students is that they were having no trouble getting in. So what's the reality? And this is the challenge, and I think the Chronicle article actually references this as is often the case, that perception does become reality. This Harvard story, this Arizona State story of the students deported after entering the United States, one a new student, others returning students being sent home, visas revoked. Those get a lot of play in the media, not only here in the United States, but back home as well. And that perception of those stories now become the reality. And Philip Altbeck was quoted in the Chronicle story that that is a serious concern for prospective students and their parents, seeing the United States as no longer a reliable destination, that even if their sons or daughters go through all the hoops that they need to get admitted, get funding, get their visas, and then come to that last hurdle of entering the United States, and then are tripped up by Border Patrol officers that are acting well above their remit in terms of what should be allowed to in terms of a review of students and of any visitor to the United States, and what they're now allowed to do. Karen Fisher's article does reference one piece in particular about the social media profile, and it says and uses language that's actually very similar to what the State Department has used in relation to the DS-160 questions that were added earlier this year at the end of May, asking for students' social media handles or profiles what their identifiers were for a list of up to 15, 20 social media sites, some of which are no longer active sites. But they were asking for those sites, and that's the same language that's used in this new Department of Homeland Security memo to CBP officers about what is allowable. Makes no mention of confiscating or reviewing actual phones. It mentions only capturing social media profiles and publicly available information. So obviously, if you're getting a hold of someone's individual phone and looking at their individual profiles, you're going far beyond what is publicly available, because you're going to their Facebook account, their QQ account, whatever it might be, on their phone. So you're seeing everything, not just their publicly available information. And this is really, really troublesome. And as I said, going beyond their remit, the memo does allow for that, the kinds of checks that the State Department is doing already at the DS-160 point when their students are applying for their non-immigrant visas, they're now asking, the CBP is now asking those same questions to students that have already got their visas legally and have gotten and are entering the country for that first time. For returning students that might not have gone through that DS-160 process, perhaps there's room for that, but for new student visas, applicants that are coming to the United States, they've already answered those questions during the visa process. Why are they having to do that again? Isn't that unnecessary duplication of effort? But this is the federal government, so I shouldn't be surprised, I assume. So again, this is one of those questions that's going to get a lot of press and will have a lot of negative implications in terms of what our prospective student audiences and their parents are going to be talking about. So going to be a real question for all of us. A related and somewhat ironic note to this, one of the stories of the ASU students that were detained and then deported, there was reports that the DHS officers had been using fake accounts that they've created on Facebook or even some social media profiles to then get the students to admit or want to participate in academic dishonesty and admit that they've cheated to get for a test score or during their time in the United States. So the CBP officers were taking it upon themselves to do that, create these fake accounts. So this latest story here I'm sharing is from Russia Times, RT, not the most reliable and effective source of media information, but they make actually a very interesting point that about social media accounts. We've all heard on how Facebook and Twitter, all these fake accounts that were supposedly or were used by Russian-influenced users to impact elections. We heard about all those, how those accounts were all purged or in the process of purging them at Facebook and Twitter. But now we've heard, not only during this story of these recent students that came and were deported, of fake accounts being used by government officials. We also have heard the story before of DHS and the University of North New Jersey and that sting operation, and the similar one in Michigan this past year, that have had where fake accounts were used for non-real entities. Facebook allowed it, Twitter allowed it, but this Russia Times article is making the point, fakes for me, not for thee. U.S. government to use false social media profiles to monitor immigrants. So that's the theme of the article. Obviously, they have other motives as well in their publications. So no need to go into too much detail on that one. So with regard to this whole visa issue, it's not certainly over with and done with yet. There's no. It's hard to know whether these stories that we're hearing are now the rule, or is this just kind of the outliers out there with regard to students that have had these challenges in their reentry or initial entry into the United States for study. So definitely something we want to keep our eyes on. Now, next story, we're going to switch gears and take a step back and look at the bigger global student mobility challenges that we face. And for those who don't know Rahul Chowdhury, he used to be at Wes and has been now was doing his own thing for a while and is now and has been at Study Portals for at least a year and a half now. He's a higher education strategist and VP there at Study Portals, He's just released a new report, Beyond 300 Billion, the Global Impact of International Students is the name of the report. And in this article in the University World News that I've just posted the link to, he goes into some detail on some of the actions that he thinks are necessary to sustain the mobility, student mobility globally. There's been obviously huge growth in the global student mobile pie. It's grown from, in 2001, it was around 2.1 million to now over 5.1 million international students in 2016. So in less than 20 years, there's been a more than doubling of that, the size of the population of globally mobile international students. But he's saying that there are a lot of challenges. He's done a lot of research on the rise of nationalism, particularly in Europe and other countries, and how that's impacting governments, individual governments' policies towards immigrants and particularly students. He does take a look at some of the barriers now that are more direct and much more harder to overcome. Barriers are related to study work visas, job market complexities, and initial visas. So these are some of the issues that he sees as some of the real challenges to countries and institutions that are looking to bring in international students to their institutions for a variety of reasons, financial and cultural and diversity factors as well. So he narrows it down to visa and immigration policies that need to become more welcoming and proactive, certainly very much in line with what most international educators here in the United States would say and abroad. And also, universities must reinvest in strategies that grow the international student body with balancing goals of diversity, quality, access, and success. And there's a lot of factors that he points to in his analysis. Obviously, economic is one of them. We know the numbers here in the U.S. of anywhere between 39 and 42 billion, depending on whether you look at the NAFTA research or the U.S. Department of Commerce research on their economic impact, international students' impact in the United States annually. But he's done a global perspective on this and has come up with this $300 billion figure, looking at UNESCO data and from 2016 and beyond. So there's both direct and indirect impacts on this in China, India, and South Korea. Between those three countries, they receive $18.3 billion of benefit. He actually looks at the United States, and his estimate there is, for the U.S., $57.3 billion is the economic impact in 2016. When you take a look at those numbers, those are obviously mind-boggling when it comes to you and I. But when it comes to the economic value of these international students to different economies, not just the United States but others as well, the UK is bringing in $25.5 billion in 2016, and each country's a piece of that pie. So it's a very good article that gives you kind of an overview of Dr. Chadha's research. And really provides us, I think, a really good look into some of the bigger picture issues that institutions need to be looking at, as well as governments. And wish that people in positions of authority in Department of State, in Department of Commerce, would see his information and say, hey, we have to be taking a more proactive approach because we're clearly dropping the ball in a lot of different areas right now on the governmental level. But there's a lot, too, that individual institutions can use from this report to benefit. So I certainly recommend everyone taking a look at that article and maybe accessing Dr. Chadha's research on that, because he does make some very valid points that I think resonate with across the international education industry. So one country, though, that is getting it correct and does have an international education strategy is Canada. If you take a look at what's been happening north of the border, it's really been a dramatic rise over the last 5 to 10 years of international students going to Canada for study. We've seen just their numbers almost double in the last 10 years, or more than double in the last 10 years. They're depending on how you count numbers, and this is where some of the number watching can get a little bit confusing. If you're looking at all international students, Canada now has somewhere between, well, I think the numbers I've seen are close to 500,000 international students. But if you look at just university level students, we're more in the range of 350,000 or so, maybe a little less than that. So what this article does, I'm going to point to a couple different articles for Canada here. First of which is someone picking up on this from Asian Pacific Post, and it was an article that came out middle of last week, showing that the economic impact in the United States or to Canada of international students was somewhere in the range of $21.6 billion for Canadian international students. So that is something, or international students in Canada. So this article from the Asia Pacific Post is actually responding to, or it's a comment on, Canada's new policy, new strategy, international education strategy, $148 million strategy to diversify the source countries of international students. Why are they doing that? They've realized that Canada in and of itself is overly reliant on, as are many countries, on Chinese and Canadian and Indian students for their international student populations. In Canada, those two countries account for 55% of all their international students. So they are definitely looking to change the diversity of their international students, and they've identified a number of countries, and they are setting target markets. And this is something that actually all universities should be doing too, if they haven't already. It's amazing to me how many universities are not going about their international student recruitment plans in a more strategic way. But Canada is certainly giving, I think, a very good, useful blueprint on how that can be done. They've identifying Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Morocco, Turkey, France, and the Ukraine as key markets where they think that they have growth opportunities to diversify their international student populations. They're doing that through scholarships, through a variety of expanding presence in those countries. They're going to be doing more work opportunity programs there, and export services for universities, helping them build capacity as well. So it's really quite a comprehensive plan in compared to what we have in the United States, which is nothing. We have the U.S. Department of State and with Education USA and Department of Commerce kind of fighting over who does what internationally and who can work with who. They do different types of services, but they very rarely can come together and cooperate and do something concrete together. It does happen in isolated occurrences. It is increasingly more so happening, but again, it's not on a coordinated national level as part of a larger strategy. It's kind of piecemeal. Where can we work this opportunity? It's not a part of a larger strategy. So from a governmental level, they are doing quite well internationally in Canada and are now building on their success. And that's something that we look when you look at it. When institutions are seeing opportunities for growth internationally, it's how they go about it. If they're not tapping into government resource to make that happen, they're kind of doing their own thing and without a lot of direction many times and a lot of options to where they can go. But there are certainly resources and there are ways to get that information that can help you identify key markets. That's one of the services we provide at SMIE Consulting as part of what we do. But countries that do that well and have an organized plan, that have resources for universities, make them publicly available and invest in what they're doing, those are the ones that are really putting themselves ahead of the game in terms of their opportunities to succeed. So what's next? One of the functions of the Canadian plan that I think is very useful is something that they call the SDS, Student Direct Stream. And what this does, it kind of fast tracks students from certain countries for visa processing. So it's where these are potential students, potential fast tracks for not only students status but also permanent residency. And what's happened is in 2018 this was launched, and it initially encompassed China, India, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Just the past month alone, they've added 3 new countries as part of this diversity effort to this SDS policy, Student Direct Stream, that gives well-positioned, that students that are well positioned for success in applying for permanent residency through express entry. So it's these are students also from Senegal and Morocco, and they've recently added Pakistan to the mix as well. So Canada has done this through the Student Direct Stream initiative, has really identified ways that international students coming in can really have a pathway, a quicker pathway to not only student success but work and potentially permanent residency. So Canada, a lot of things that they can do that we can't do here in the U.S., but certainly they're taking it now in a much more constructive way through a national policy, and I think that's something that we can only dream of here in the United States, as we've talked about before. But certainly the way that they've identified markets and some of the things that they're doing to help streamline the process for students in those markets as a part of their diversification efforts are really something that we can all see value in, I think, from the U.S. side. So I want to stop the midweek roundup at this point and just end with a plea to, just not a plea really, just a request to ask those that are watching live today. Obviously, September 11th, we remember what happened 18 years ago. Many of my colleagues who have been around and were in the field back then certainly have very vivid stories that they would tell about where they were in the world when this happened. My wife and I were actually living in England at the time. We had been working at ACS International in Cobham, outside of London, for it was going on a year and a half by the time September 11th rolled around. So we got the news right at the end of the school day as students were being dismissed, getting on their buses, being picked up, and going home for the day. Remember going into our offices, admissions and counseling offices, and seeing on the news, seeing the TV images of that first plane going into the first tower, and then while we're watching that news, seeing the second plane come in, and that forever changed our lives as Americans. At that time, Americans living abroad. I tell you what, when we came home for Christmas that year in 2001. That was just, it was a different world we came home to. Just remembering the unity that existed in the country after the attacks, and how flags were everywhere on every street, and the sense of we're in it together, we're looking out for each other. Those are stories that I think, remembering that, looking back at that time, that we felt very disconnected from what was going on here. Obviously, we weren't living in the U.S. at that time. But coming back to that, we returned home for good in June of 2002. But that was a really interesting time for us to see how our country had changed, being from the outside looking in. So we have very significant memories of that day, and I'm sure many of you do have as well. And I just, as we all do, we will never forget what happened and the sacrifices made by the heroes on that day and the days and weeks afterwards, searching for survivors, and obviously those that volunteered in the military to go fight for us, for our country. And that's those are sacrifices that are just immense ones that were made for our country on that day and beyond. Some sacrifices are still being made. So thank you to everyone who served in any way since 9/11 and around those days, and what you do in international education, it matters. And wish all of us the best of success in the coming weeks and months as we deal with some very real and obvious obstacles in our work. But we can do it. We can get through it together and focus on that which we can control. And when we do that, we can only succeed. So best of luck to all of you, and we'll be in touch soon. Cheers.